The homeless man whispered hoarsely. "Don't talk. Just listen." Officer Rachel Torres froze. She had just stepped out of her patrol car when the ragged figure leaning against a brick wall caught her attention. At first glance, he looked like countless other forgotten souls of the city, dirty clothes, unkempt beard, long tangled hair dripping from the drizzle. But his eyes burned with urgency. At his side, a loyal mutt growled, staring intently into the shadows of the alley. Rachel's instincts screamed danger, but her hand hesitated on her holster. Something about his tone made her pause. Rachel studied him for a moment longer. He didn't flinch, didn't stumble like someone intoxicated. His voice, though rough, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Behind you," he whispered again. She glanced over her shoulder toward the dark alley. Trash cans lined the wall, dripping water from the rain, but nothing seemed unusual. Still, her gut tightened. The dog's growl deepened, its hackles raised. Rachel's training told her to trust both instincts and signals, and both were screaming at her now. The man slowly raised a dirty hand, pointing toward the shadows. "He's been waiting there," he said quietly, lips trembling. "Watched you drive up. I saw him follow you." Rachel's pulse quickened. She pressed her back against the car, hand firm on her weapon, eyes narrowing at the alley's edge. The drizzle turned heavier, adding tension to the moment. Rachel realized she was caught in the middle of two worlds, a uniformed protector of the law and a ragged man society dismissed, warning her of something unseen. She whispered sharply, "Who's there?" Her voice echoed off the wet brick walls. No answer came, only the trickle of water from the rooftops. Rachel's breathing slowed as she focused on every sound. Suddenly, a faint scuffle broke the silence, shoes brushing against pavement, quick and nervous. Her muscles tensed. The homeless man's dog barked once, sharp and fierce, pulling at the moment. Rachel lifted her flashlight and aimed it toward the alley, the beam slicing through the rain like a blade. A figure bolted from the darkness. Rachel reacted instantly, hand snapping to her gun, but the homeless man's hoarse voice cut through the chaos. "Don't shoot. He's got a knife." The stranger lunged forward, a glint of metal catching the dim street light. Rachel sidestepped, pulling her weapon free, heart hammering. The dog snarled, leaping forward, teeth flashing. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Rachel had to decide, pull the trigger or trust the warning. That fraction of hesitation was enough for the fight to truly begin. The stranger stumbled but didn't stop. He lunged closer, knife raised high. Rachel dodged backward, her foot slipping slightly on the wet ground. The homeless man, without a second thought, pushed himself forward, intercepting the attacker. His ragged body crashed into the knife-wielding figure, both tumbling into the puddles on the ground. Rachel froze, her gun raised, unsure whether to shoot. The dog barked and snapped at the assailant, buying precious seconds. Rain poured down heavier, soaking them all, turning the fight into a chaotic blur of movements and shadows. Rachel shouted, "Get off him!" But the homeless man grunted, holding the stranger's arm back with all his strength. The knife slashed inches from his face, but he didn't let go. Rachel circled quickly, aiming her gun, trying to find a clear shot without hitting her unexpected ally. Her breath came in sharp bursts, adrenaline surging. Finally, with a loud crack, she fired one warning shot into the air. The sound shattered the night. The attacker flinched, giving the homeless man just enough leverage to wrench the knife free and toss it aside. The knife skittered across the wet pavement, landing near Rachel's boots. She immediately kicked it away, far out of reach. The attacker struggled violently under the homeless man's grip, but he was weakening. Rachel moved closer, snapping her cuffs from her belt. With one swift motion, she pinned the man's arm and clamped the metal tight. The sound of the click echoed like a final punctuation. The man growled curses under his breath, but the fight was over. Rachel exhaled, trembling slightly, still processing the danger she had narrowly avoided. When it was done, she turned to the homeless man. His chest heaved with exhaustion, hair plastered to his face from the rain. His dog sat loyally at his side again, tail wagging faintly as if proud. Rachel stared at him, struggling to find words. "You," she began, but stopped. For once in her career, she realized her life had been saved not by her training, not by backup, but by someone society dismissed as worthless. Someone who had nothing, yet risked everything. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on her heart. Rachel holstered her weapon slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. The man shrugged, wiping rain and dirt from his forehead. "So could you," he rasped. There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance, only a simple truth. His dog nudged his leg, as if reminding him of the bond they shared in surviving another night. Rachel suddenly felt a pang of guilt for the suspicion she had felt when she first saw him. She had been wrong, and she knew it. She gestured toward her car, thinking he might need help, maybe even a hospital. But the man shook his head. "No hospitals," he said firmly. His eyes flickered with something fear, perhaps shame. Rachel hesitated, torn between duty and respect. She wanted to press, but something in his tone told her not to. Instead, she offered him a blanket from her patrol car. He accepted it silently, draping it over his soaked shoulders. The dog curled up against his side, both of them shivering from the cold. Rachel crouched down to his level, studying him more closely. Beneath the dirt and weariness, she could see intelligence in his gaze. His words earlier replayed in her mind, sharp, urgent, life-saving. She realized he wasn't just another homeless man. He had a story, one hidden beneath layers of pain and survival. She wondered how someone like him ended up here, on these streets, with nothing but a dog to call family. The question weighed on her, but she didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, Rachel said softly, "Thank you." 2 words, but heavy with sincerity. The man looked at her for a long moment, as though measuring her honesty. Finally, he nodded, his lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. His dog licked his hand, breaking the tension. For the first time that night, Rachel allowed herself to feel relief. She had been saved, not by her badge or her gun, but by the humanity of someone no one else would notice. She radioed for backup, her voice steady again. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the street. Officers poured in, securing the suspect and taking statements. Some glanced curiously at the homeless man, but Rachel shut down any comments with a look. She owed him more than anyone could understand. When one officer asked who had stopped the attacker, Rachel simply replied, "He did." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with disbelief and a hint of respect. The homeless man shifted uncomfortably under their gazes. He wasn't seeking praise. He wanted to disappear back into the shadows, where he had come from. Rachel sensed it. Before he could slip away, she stopped him. "Wait," she said, stepping closer. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then answered in a whisper, "David." It was simple, almost fragile, like a truth he hadn't spoken in years. Rachel repeated it softly, committing it to memory. David, the man who had saved her life. As the rain eased, Rachel offered him a ride somewhere warm. He declined again, insisting he was fine where he was. She didn't push, but she did leave him with food from her trunk, packaged meals she usually carried for long shifts. David accepted it quietly, his dog wagging its tail at the sight. Rachel watched as he retreated into the shadows, blanket wrapped tight, dog at his side. She felt an ache in her chest, knowing she might never see him again, yet hoping she would. Driving away, Rachel couldn't shake the image of him from her mind. She replayed the events over and over, the urgency in his voice, the bravery in his actions, the selflessness in his sacrifice. He had been invisible to the world, but to her he was unforgettable. She realized her duty wasn't just to enforce the law, but to see the humanity in those society ignored. And tonight, that lesson had been written in rain, blood, and courage. Rachel returned to the station hours later, drenched and exhausted. When her colleagues asked what had happened, she kept her answers short. Some wouldn't believe her, others wouldn't care. But she knew the truth. Somewhere in the city, a homeless man named David and his dog were alive, and so was she because he had chosen to act. That was a story no report could ever truly capture. And deep down, Rachel promised herself, this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. She would find him again. Because heroes come in many forms, and sometimes they wear rags instead of badges. The next morning, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about David. She replayed the scene over and over, the rain, the knife, the raw courage of a man who had nothing. She wanted to know more about him. But the city swallowed people like him easily. Homeless faces blurred into the background, becoming invisible. Still, Rachel felt compelled to search. She drove the same streets, checked alleys, and even asked around in shelters. Everyone had heard of the guy with the dog, but no one knew exactly where he stayed. David remained a ghost in plain sight. Days passed, but Rachel didn't give up. One night, while patrolling a quieter district, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against a crumbling wall. His dog was curled at his feet, its ears perking up at the sound of her car. Rachel pulled over and approached slowly. David lifted his head, surprised but calm. "Thought you'd forgotten," he said hoarsely. Rachel shook her head. "Not a chance." She handed him a fresh sandwich and some bottled water. He accepted silently, but his eyes softened. It was the beginning of an unspoken trust. Rachel sat on the curb beside him, ignoring the stares of passers-by. "Why'd you do it?" she asked after a long silence. David didn't answer right away. He scratched the dog's ear, eyes fixed on the wet pavement. Finally, he said, "Because no one else would, and because you didn't look at me like trash when you saw me." His words struck Rachel deeply. She realized how often people like him were dismissed, ignored, dehumanized. For David, that one moment of acknowledgement had been enough reason to risk everything. Over the following weeks, Rachel kept finding reasons to check in on him. She'd bring food, a blanket, or sometimes just conversation. David was reluctant to share his story, but pieces slipped through. He had once held a steady job, even had a small apartment. Life, however, had unraveled quickly an accident, medical bills, the loss of his family, and soon the streets became his only home. Through it all, his dog, Max, had been his anchor. "He saved me more than once," David admitted, rubbing Max's head. Rachel understood the weight behind those words. Rachel started noticing how sharp David's mind was. He spoke several languages, knew history and literature, and had a perspective on the city she rarely heard. "You're wasted out here," she told him once. He only smiled bitterly. "The world doesn't want men like me anymore." But Rachel disagreed. She began to see David not as a hobo, but as someone with dignity, courage, and wisdom hidden beneath the grime. Each encounter deepened her respect for him. Slowly, she began to wonder if maybe she was supposed to be part of his story. One stormy night, Rachel found David sheltering under a bridge. The rain pounded like hammers, and the cold cut through everything. She insisted he come with her, just for the night, to the precinct's spare cot. He resisted, but Max nudged him forward as if giving permission. Reluctantly, David agreed. When he entered the station, curious eyes followed. Officers whispered, some sneering, but Rachel stood firm. "He saved my life," she reminded them. That silenced the room. For one night, David and Max had a roof, warmth, and food. David didn't stay long at the precinct, but the experience left an impression. "It felt strange," he admitted later. "Like I didn't belong, but also like I remembered what it was to be human again." Rachel assured him that he had never lost that humanity. Slowly, their bond grew into something more than gratitude. It became friendship. She realized she looked forward to their conversations, the quiet wisdom he carried, and even the way Max wagged his tail when he saw her. In the chaos of her job, David became her calm. But trouble wasn't far. One evening, Rachel was called to a disturbance near an abandoned warehouse. When she arrived, she realized with dread that David was involved. A group of gang members had cornered him, mocking his ragged clothes, threatening to take Max. Rachel's heart pounded as she rushed in. "Police! Drop it!" she shouted. The gang sneered, but scattered when backup arrived. David had bruises on his face, but Max was safe. Rachel knelt beside him, helping him up. His eyes met hers with quiet gratitude, but also shame at being seen so vulnerable. That night, Rachel stayed longer than she should have, patching his wounds with a small first aid kit from her car. "You don't owe me this," he muttered. Rachel shook her head firmly. "You saved me once. Now it's my turn." For the first time, David didn't argue. He let her help, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Rachel realized this man, discarded by society, had become one of the most important people in her life. It scared her, but it also gave her a strange kind of hope. Weeks rolled by, and their friendship deepened. Rachel began leaving small notes at the spots she knew David frequented, reminders to meet, or simply kind words. David saved them carefully, hidden in the folds of his worn jacket. To him, they were treasures. Max, too, grew fond of Rachel, often running to greet her with wagging tail and wet nose. The three of them formed an unlikely bond: a cop, a homeless man, and a loyal dog. The city was still cruel, but together they carved out moments of warmth in its cold streets. Rachel started asking herself a dangerous question. What if David could start again? She looked into shelters, rehabilitation programs, even temporary jobs. Each time, David resisted. "I'm fine out here," he'd say. But Rachel saw through the lie. She saw the weariness in his bones, the longing in his eyes whenever they passed families or warm cafes. He was surviving, not living. And Rachel wasn't ready to let him fade away into the city's forgotten corners. She wanted more for him, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Then came a turning point. One night, Rachel responded to a call about a missing child. Desperate parents had reported their son vanished in a park. Hours passed with no leads. Just as hope was dimming, David appeared, Max pulling eagerly at his side. "He's in there," David said, pointing to a locked shed. Rachel was skeptical, but she trusted him. Breaking it open, they found the terrified boy inside. Rachel's colleagues stared in disbelief. Once again, the man no one trusted had saved a life. David simply walked away, whispering. The dog knew. Rachel couldn't stay silent any longer. She called after him. "David, people need you. Not just me. Everyone." He froze, then turned slowly, eyes searching hers. She continued, "You have more to give than you realize. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." The words hit him harder than any storm ever could. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different life, not just wandering, not just surviving, but helping, belonging, being seen. Max barked once, as if agreeing. David didn't answer, but his silence carried weight. The next day, Rachel spoke with her captain. She explained everything: the night David saved her, the child in the shed, the countless small acts of courage. At first, her captain scoffed, but Rachel's persistence wore him down. "Fine," he said. "I'll meet him." When David was brought in, he looked uncomfortable under the fluorescent lights, clutching Max's leash tightly. But Rachel stood beside him, introducing him not as a vagrant, but as a hero. Slowly, disbelief turned into consideration. For once, David wasn't invisible. He was acknowledged. The captain offered David a chance: part-time work at the station as a translator for immigrant communities. Rachel had learned he spoke multiple languages from their talks. At first, David resisted. But Rachel urged him gently. "It's not charity," she said. "It's purpose." Finally, David agreed, though nervously. His first day was rough stares, whispers, doubt. But when he helped a frightened family explain their case, everything changed. People saw his worth. Rachel watched from a distance, pride swelling in her chest. For the first time in years, David wasn't surviving, he was living. Weeks turned into months. David wasn't a cop, but he was part of the team. His skills, his intuition, and his courage made him invaluable. Slowly, he began to rebuild not just his role in society, but his sense of self. Max remained by his side, now known affectionately as the station's unofficial mascot. Rachel saw the transformation unfold, and with it, her feelings deepened. She realized she didn't just admire David. She cared for him in a way she hadn't expected. It scared her, but she no longer wanted to hide it. One evening, after a long shift, Rachel found David outside the station, staring at the city lights. She approached quietly, Max wagging his tail at her arrival. "You look different," she said softly. David chuckled. "Cleaner clothes, maybe." Rachel shook her head. "No, you carry yourself differently, like someone who belongs." David grew quiet, then whispered, "That's because of you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rachel's heart skipped. She realized the walls she had built around her heart were crumbling, brick by brick. Still, David struggled with his past. There were nights he disappeared, unable to face the weight of responsibility. Rachel worried, but she never gave up. Each time, she found him, reminded him he wasn't alone. Slowly, he began to believe it. For David, belonging wasn't about the station or society. It was about Rachel and Max, the family he never thought he deserved. Together, they created something unbreakable. The city still whispered, but he no longer cared. He had found his place. Months later, On a quiet evening, Rachel asked him gently, "What do you want for your future, David?" He looked at her, then at Max, and finally back at her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in years, I want one." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then let's build it together." It was a promise, unspoken but real. Under the city lights, with Max resting peacefully between them, a cop and a homeless man found hope not just in survival, but in the possibility of a new life. The city had started whispering David's name. Word of the missing child he and Max had saved spread far beyond the precinct. Newspapers ran stories, calling him the unlikely hero. For a man who once hid in shadows, the attention felt surreal. He wasn't used to cameras or praise. But each time he felt overwhelmed, he glanced at Rachel. Her steady smile anchored him. She never treated him as a symbol, only as himself. That quiet authenticity reminded David that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep showing up, one day at a time. With Rachel's encouragement, David agreed to attend a community meeting. Parents wanted to thank him in person, children wanted to pet Max, and officials wanted him to speak. He nearly backed out, but Rachel squeezed his hand gently. "Just tell them your truth," she whispered. Standing before the crowd, David's voice trembled at first. He spoke of hardship, of being unseen, of survival. But then he spoke of hope, how one act of kindness had reminded him he still mattered. By the end, the room was silent, eyes glistening with emotion. The precinct decided to make his role permanent. Though he wasn't an officer, his ability to connect with the forgotten became invaluable. He mediated disputes, helped bridge cultural divides, and even guided young people away from gangs. Max became a local legend, his barking seen as a warning no one dared ignore. David felt pride for the first time in years. Pride not in wealth or status, but in the quiet truth that he had turned pain into purpose. In every step of that transformation, Rachel had been by his side, believing when he couldn't. One evening, Rachel invited him to dinner at her apartment. Nervous, David brought flowers he had bought with his first paycheck. He laughed at himself, thinking how strange it felt to be nervous about something so simple. Rachel opened the door, her eyes widening at the flowers. "They're beautiful," she said softly. For the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to feel something tender. They talked for hours over homemade pasta. Between laughter and long silences, a new understanding grew. They weren't just allies anymore. They were two hearts cautiously reaching toward each other. Yet doubt lingered. Alone later, David stared into the mirror, seeing the scars of his past etched deep. "What could she possibly see in me?" he murmured. Max nudged his leg, as if to argue. Rachel, too, seemed unshaken by his self-doubt. Each time he tried to push her away, she drew closer, not with pity, but with respect. She didn't want to erase his past. She wanted to walk with him through it. Slowly, David realized that maybe love wasn't about being flawless. Maybe it was about being seen, completely, and still accepted. The city's storms hadn't stopped. Crime, poverty, and injustice still raged on. But now, David faced them differently. With Rachel and Max, he wasn't just enduring, he was building. Sometimes they patrolled together unofficially, her in uniform, him in warm boots, Max trotting proudly at their side. They made an odd trio, but to the people they helped, they symbolized something powerful: redemption, partnership, hope. Children began to greet David by name, tugging at Max's fur. Elderly neighbors offered warm meals, For a man who once believed he had nothing, these gestures felt like treasures. Rachel's captain called her into his office one day. "You've changed since he came into your life," he said bluntly. She braced herself for criticism, but instead he smiled. "For the better. You fight harder. You care deeper. Maybe we all needed someone like David to remind us why we wear the badge." Rachel left the office with tears in her eyes. She found David outside, leaning against the wall, Max curled nearby. She simply whispered, "You're changing more lives than you realize." For once, David didn't argue. He just let the truth sink in. The turning point came at a city ceremony where David was formally recognized for bravery. Standing on stage, he fidgeted nervously, but Rachel's presence steadied him. When asked to speak, he didn't tell a story of heroism. Instead, he said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who was given a second chance. Don't look at me. Look at those you ignore every day. They matter too." The applause that followed was thunderous. Rachel's eyes shone with pride, knowing he had spoken not for himself, but for all the unseen souls still waiting for their chance. That night, as they walked home together, the city lights glowing around them, Rachel slipped her hand into his. David stiffened, then relaxed, letting warmth flood through him. For so long, he had been cold inside and out, but now something had changed. With Rachel's faith and Max's loyalty, he had found not just survival, but belonging. "Do you ever think about tomorrow?" Rachel asked quietly. David looked at her, then at Max. A small smile touched his lips. "For the first time in years," he replied, "I actually do." It was hope, fragile but real. Months later, David moved into a modest apartment, his first home in years. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but to him, it was a palace. Max had his own corner with a bed and toys, courtesy of Rachel. One evening, as Rachel helped him unpack, David paused. "You saved me," he whispered. Rachel shook her head. "No, you saved yourself. I just reminded you who you are." David pulled her close, grateful and humbled. At last, his journey from forgotten man to valued soul was complete. And in that new life, love had finally found him.